Close the door in the back, that would be lovely. Thank you very much. Okay, so for our high school Lincoln Douglas final, we have on the affirmative side, from Dalton Foreign School, Leo Bay. And on the negative side, from Jakarta International School, we have Yongju Ro. Judges, are you ready? Yes. Okay.
Alright, before we start the time, I think it's necessary for me to say several things to say to the judges and other things, other people, because if we're so busy with this tournament, we don't take some time to appreciate things that we're supposed to appreciate. So before I start my speech, I'd like to say first, thank you for all the judges for coming all the way here, sacrificing their time. Without you guys, we wouldn't be here up here today. Obviously, I would also like to thank the KNFL for promoting freedom of speech for me and my opponent up here today. And also, obviously, we have to thank the CEO, Haiti, and Jin for making this tournament very in a smooth run. So, with that being said, let's start.
Are you ready?
Judges, ready? Opponent, ready? Let's go. Aristotle once stated, quote, "The guest will judge better of a feast than the cook," end quote. Since I agree with Aristotle, I believe that students are the best judges for teacher effectiveness, and that is why I strongly support the resolution. Resolved, public schools should use student-based teacher evaluation and teacher quality assessments. Now that understood, I'd like to take some time to find some key terms. Student-based. According to Journal of Management of Education 2014, Damon E. defines student-based evaluation as generally include variables such as enthusiasm, clarity of the presentation, course difficulty, etc., in a survey. This definition extends to grades and standardized test scores. Public schools. According to your Merriam Dictionary, defines public school as a school that gets money from and is controlled by a local government. For clarification, the age group we're including in this debate is ranging from kindergarten all the way to college. With the resolution defined, let me move on to the value. I must offer the value of education in today's round. The reason why education should be the value is because education is essential in our society. According to the State Department of Education, the United States has the highest incarceration rate in the world, and 80% of juveniles in the justice system cannot read. According to the New York Times, more than 60% of all prison inmates are functionally illiterate. 1 in 10 male high school dropouts is in jail, compared with 1 in 35 young male high school graduates. Secondly, 2/3 of students who cannot read above a 4th grade proficiency level end up in jail or on welfare. Thirdly, penal institution reports show that the inmates have a 16% chance of returning to prison if they receive a literacy help, as opposed to 70% who receive no help. Since education is very important, education should be the value for this round. The criteria is whoever opposes education better will win this debate. With the value of education, let me move on directly to the contentions to support my case here today. Contention 1, student-based evaluation is necessary. Subpoint A, status quo does not work. Teacher quality was determined by an observation conducted by a principal and teacher. In 2009, the organization TNTP published a widget effect and found the following things about the status quo. These are the key findings. 1, all teachers rated good or great. Less than 1% of teachers receive unsatisfactory ratings. 2, professional development is inadequate. Almost 3 in 4 teachers do not receive any specific feedback. 3, lowest teachers are neglected. Low expectations for beginning teachers translating to neglect in the classroom. 4, poor performance was unaddressed. Half of the districts studied have not dismissed a single tenured teacher for poor performance in the past 5 years. Subpoint B, student-based evaluations are trustworthy. According to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, it stated the average students know effective teaching when he or she experiences it. Also, the analysis performed by MIT researchers showed that perceptions of a given teacher are consistent across different classes of students. Students are able to clearly differentiate between teachers. Therefore, it is necessary to implement student-based evaluation because it does reach the values of education, since students are able to fix their own problem with student-based evaluation, and it is the most reliable tool so far. Contention 2. Student-based evaluation leads to the highest quality of education. Subpoint A. Student-based evaluation is effective, helping teachers improve their classroom directions. According to Ryan Belch of Vanderbilt University, stated that researchers found that student surveys at various levels were valid and reliable teacher evaluation measures. This aligns with international research from Cyprus, where student surveys of teachers' practices were highly correlated with achievement gains in math and Greek language, as well as other effective outcomes of schooling. Subpoint B. Student-based evaluations cause students to be self-motivated. A report issued by Advocates for Children of New York, published in June 2012, stated the following things. Meaningful student involvement improves student engagement and gives young people ownership of their own education. Student engagement has been shown to improve academic outcomes and increase the likelihood of high school completion. Students who feel connected to school have more positive academic attitudes and are more likely to continue to attend school. And this also reaches the value of education because student-based evaluation is a tool for students to be self-engaged in their own learning, and it does lead to the highest quality of education because of student-based evaluations. Contention 3. Current bureaucracy protects bad teacher. Subpoint A. Teacher tenure. Even though there are many teachers out there that are excellent, it is still impossible to fire bad teachers, according to Scott Walden. He explains this reasoning by stating, quote, "It appears to be nearly impossible for a school district to fire a tenured public school teacher. The reason is twofold. Job protection for unionized teachers is strong, and the process for firing bad teachers is so drawn out and costly that most districts can't afford it," end quote. The LA Times 2009 stated that less than 1% of teachers were fired. It shows that obviously the current status quo is protecting bad teachers. Subpoint B. Bad practices of firing teachers. The LA Times 2009 stated that 80% of the teachers that were fired because of administrative reasons, not academic performance of students in the classroom. This shows that not only that the current status quo is protecting bad teachers, but there's also a huge possibility that schools are firing good teachers that can help students enhance their academic performance. Subpoint C. Teachers are vital to student success. According to Prince Frank, the Educational Trust Organization from Stanford, 2013, talked about how teachers are very vital, if not the most important factor for student success, by stating, quote, "So analysis attribute low student achievement to the quality of public schools as their single most important predictor of student outcomes," end quote. Since that's the case, not only there's a reason why we should go focus on teacher quality effectiveness, but also see a reason why we should have to evaluate them. Therefore, vote for pro. Thank you.
Okay. Great. Whenever you guys are ready, go ahead.
In your value, you stated that the value must be education. What aspect of education are we actually looking at?
As you can see, we're actually looking at the highest quality of education
And how are you ever going to measure this?
by looking at the evidence,
What evidence?
all the evidence I've shown throughout my case.
Okay, moving on to my next question. You said in your first contention that the widget effect proved that teachers and principal evaluations are bad, correct?
Correct.
But in the widget effect, it states that principals evaluated teachers twice in a year. Isn't it more effective if we increase the amount of evaluations done?
It's very funny that you actually state that because according to the Harvard institution, it actually states that principal evaluations and teacher evaluations actually does not work and made the education much more worse compared to student-based evaluations.
So do you have any evidence that student-based evaluations will fix this system?
I already gave you that on my second contention and my third contention. That's what my whole case was about.
Or is it actually directly connected?
It actually does work, and what you have to understand is that Boston Public Schools actually did implement student-based evaluations 4 years ago. What we see is that actually the graduation rate actually increased by 2.3%, and the consecutive year actually improved by 3.5%. So it does show that student-based evaluation also works in the hypothetical world and also realistically.
Okay, so if we are implementing student-based evaluations and teacher quality assessments, how much weight will these assessments have, or will it replace the whole system?
Well, what I'm saying is that actually student-based evaluation should just be a part of the way to evaluate teacher quality assessment by using the checks and balance system.
Can you further elaborate on the check and balance system?
So what I mean by this is that as an affirmative, it's not my burden of proof to show that it's only student-based evaluation that should work. My burden of proof is to show that student-based evaluations will be successful in terms of checks and balances system with other ways to evaluate teacher quality assessments.
Okay. For your contention 1, subpoint B, you stated that students were reliable due to the study
Correct.
of Willem and the Gates Foundation.
Correct.
Are you aware of the fact that these studies did not include minorities, such as disabled kids or students under the poverty line?
Well, that was a great question because according to New York Times, it actually implemented the same methodology, but it did work on poor districts and the special needs, and it still made the same results. And they actually studied for it for 8 years, which is enough of evidence to show that it is reliable.
Okay. In your contention 2, you said that we should empower students in the classroom. Do you think that this is actually effective?
Wait, sorry, can you rephrase your question?
In your contention 2, you said that students should have more power in the classroom through student-based evaluations.
I never said that.
You said they were effective, and they should
I just
be
said
engaged.
effective. It doesn't mean that.
You said they should be engaged in the classroom.
Right, that's the
Do you think giving this power to students is actually reliable?
Giving what power?
The power to discriminate against teachers?
I already said there's a check and balance system that's being implemented. I already told you that that's not my burden of proof.
Okay, thank you.
Are you ready? Or do you need time for that?
I'll use 1 minute for
Okay. And you can use a wireless microphone.
Is this very clear? Okay. Before I begin my timer, I'd also like to thank all the judges for being here, spending their valuable time, and all the NFL coordinators and all my peers who supported me during this process. Shall I begin?
Yes.
Okay. On March 24th, 2014, the Daily Mail UK has posted an article showing YouTube videos of kids from public schools laughing at how they got their teachers fired through false allegations, Googling about how to fire their own teachers, and tutorials on how to dismiss their own teachers. This clearly shows you the viciousness of students and why they should not be trusted, therefore not accounted with student-based teacher evaluations. Since I believe that students are malicious and lack the maturity to make these decisions, I strongly oppose the resolution resolved public schools should use student-based teacher evaluations and teacher quality assessments. Since I agree with the affirmative definitions, I'll now move on to my value. The value for this round is pragmatism. John Dewey defined pragmatism as doctrine that evaluates any assertion solely by its practical consequences and its bearing on human interests. He provided a philosophical view of education by stating, quote, "Interest is not enough. It is necessary, but not a sufficient condition for selecting an area of concern. It should also offer a challenge and significant amount of educational value. It is important that the subject selected by the students be one to which they are committed to as wholeheartedly as possible, for if the topic has their commitment, then the value of self-direction may be implemented. Then there is highest quality of education." Close quote. Since the idea of pragmatism leads to the highest quality of education, the value must be pragmatism because it is both affirmative and in its best interest to uphold the highest quality of education. Before I move on to my contentions, I would like to provide a burden of proof from the pro side. In order for the affirmative to take this debate home, it must first prove that student-based evaluations are actually effective against the current status quo system in a sensible and effective manner. Secondly, they must show the significance of student-based evaluations, and last but not least, they must prove that student-based evaluations does not have adverse side effects. Now I'll move on to my first contention. Contention 1, students are not capable of evaluating teachers. Subpoint A, students are malicious. During the shifting social boundaries of the 1960s, students in China were given an opportunity. Suddenly, they could question or criticize their teachers. However, this opportunity for feedback and this assessment evolved into beating, torture, and the murders of teachers by the Red Summer of August 1966. While the idea that students will murder their teachers is an extreme example, the lesson of the Red Guards incident is that students can turn into vicious beings against their teachers under the correct circumstances that the status quo is providing. This speaks to the darker side of student social nature, bullying. According to the Washington Post, bullying is the leading cause of death for South Korean youth. Every day in South Korea, there are on average 219 incidents of school violence. The potential maliciousness of teenagers, together with their social natures, makes student-based teacher evaluations a particularly dangerous proposition. According to the National Institute of Mental Health, the brain is also not fully developed until the mid-20s. Therefore, there are areas of the brain that regulates emotion control, and long-term decision-making is not developed until the final stages. Subpoint B, peer pressure. Teenagers are more social than adults and desire social acceptance far more than adults. Studies show that teenagers will often make riskier decisions when watched or with friends. As studies have shown, students are 50% more likely to get into car accidents when they are driving with friends. The power of student evaluation will give students with the power to extract revenge on teachers who perceived slights. Students seeking social acceptance may also follow other students in giving poor reviews regardless of their teacher's actual performance. Subpoint C, Korean student constitution. Given the power of student-based assessments, this will further weaken the control the Korean teachers have in their classrooms. The Korean Herald states that more Korean teachers are leaving the field due to the aggressiveness of their students ever since the student constitution. Evidence states that 4 times more teachers are leaving, and therefore this is a serious issue. Since student-based teacher evaluations will deteriorate the classroom environment even worse, this is neither pragmatic nor does it uphold the highest quality of education. So the resolution cannot stand. Contention 2. Student-based evaluation diminishes the quality of education. Subpoint A. Strong test focus hurts education. In 2012, South Korean Teacher Union began to petition the government to detach student-based evaluation standardized test scores from school funding decisions. The unions argue that the high stakes of tests diminish their quality of education. This is supported by the evidence from the National Center of Fair and Open Testing, stating that teaching to specifically produce high test scores is a bad policy. Teaching to the test narrows the curriculum to the subjects and skills on the test. Many skills such as creativity and problem solving are underdeveloped since they are not easily tested. Furthermore, a strong test focus lowers student engagement, alienating students whose strengths lie outside tested subjects or who don't learn through well with drilling and memorization. Subpoint B, student-based evaluation promotes cheating. According to the National Center of Fair and Open Testing, pressure from high-stakes testing can lead to cheating. As test results are often a factor in promotions, raises, school funding, or teacher evaluations, teachers inevitably will try to raise those scores. Teachers can cheat in a multitude of ways, by giving away answers, leaving important information on the board or walls, looking the other way while students teach, and even correcting students' answer after the tests are done. Cities such as Houston, Atlanta, and Washington, D.C. have dealt with high cheating scandals, as many standardized tests in these districts have been found with a high number of erasures. According to the New York Times, 12 former Atlanta public school teachers and administrators will go on trial for conspiring to cheat on standardized tests. Now I'd like to move on to the rebuttals against the affirmative cases. First of all, in their contention to subpoint B, they stated that student-based evaluations will actually increase self-motivation in another manner. However, I would like to state evidence from Texas A&M research stating that it is 80 to 90% of student motivation is actually due to family backgrounds and how they have grown up in their early stages of life. In addition, so therefore their argument for that does not work. Also, in their first contention, they stated that student evaluations are necessary and the status quo does not work because administrators are failing to fire their teachers. However, I'd like to say that this argument is also invalid and that promoting student-based evaluations to fix this problem is not effective and neither dramatic. Thank you.
Are you ready for your rebuttal? Right?
Cross
forward.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, yes. Go ahead.
Judges ready?
Yep.
Opponent? Okay. Your value is pragmatism, correct?
Correct.
Basically saying that consequences, right?
Yes.
So how is it possible? How does looking at the consequence leads to highest quality of education?
I'm saying that if we look at the consequences and measured how.
Right, but you said how consequence leads to the highest quality of education.
Right.
So I don't see the link right there.
If student-based evaluations have those severe consequences, then they won't lead to highest quality of education.
Right, you mentioned about challenge, self-interest, and self-direction, correct?
Yes.
How does that fit under your definition of pragmatism?
If student-based teacher evaluations,
I know I'm outside this context of resolution. I don't see how challenge, self-interest, self-direction is related to a value definition of consequence. I see no relation there.
if students are challenged and there are consequences brought by that, then it is not pragmatic.
But isn't self-interest and self-direction, isn't student-based evaluation an act of self-interest, self-direction, and challenge?
No, because it diminishes the quality of education, so therefore,
Let's actually talk about the dimension of education, your second condition. You talked about how Houston, Atlantic, and Washington, D.C. was found to be cheating in standardized test scores, correct?
correct.
You know that they don't practice student-based evaluations right now, correct, right?
Standardized test scores is a part of student-based teacher evaluations.
Right, but I mean like student-based evaluations as in like surveys. You know that they're not being implemented in Houston, Atlantic, and Washington, D.C., correct?
Yes.
So how does this show that student-based evaluation is a causation to these things?
Since standardized test scores are a part of student-based evaluations, implementing student-based evaluations will lead to the same results.
Okay, am I saying that students should have the full power to fire teachers, or it does lead to the dangers of teachers?
Giving them a weight to say whether a teacher
But I
is
talked
bad
about
or
checks and balances of power, so wouldn't that actually fix the problem? How? Why not? Alright, okay, I'll just move on to the next question. Let's look at your first contention, sub-point A. You talk about maliciousness, right? China example, correct? Did they use student-based evaluations?
They gave students a voice and they were
Okay, isn't it active student-based evaluations though?
It is.
How?
Because they were given the opportunity for feedback, which is a part of student-based evaluations.
So you're now just taking parts of my definitions and changing by situations. Isn't it fair for you to actually take my whole definition of student-based and actually see what's going on, instead of taking parts of my definitions and applying it to different situations?
So are you saying that all these components have to be met to define student-based evaluations?
Right. You can't just take parts of it and then match it with another situation and then say it's bad.
But then these are all consequences from those situations.
But you're taking parts of my definitions and putting it in different situations.
So
I explicitly stated that general management says it needs to reach all of these areas, correct? Okay, all right. So let's. All right, time's up. Thank you.
Thank you. Do you need time?
Oh no, I'm
Okay.
straight.
Go ahead.
All right, opponent. Judges ready?
Yes.
Opponent. Alvin. Okay, let's go. So let's actually take a look at my opponent's case. Starting off with the value of pragmatism. As you can see, during cross-sex is a very important thing we have to talk about. There's a problem with this value. First, the value of pragmatism focuses too much on the consequence. Every decision we make contains a negative consequence. So the point is, if we focus too much on the consequence, we're really not going to go anywhere. We will not make any progress if we're so concerned with the consequence. For an example, driving a car. Driving a car is a daily and simple decision we make. There's a negative consequence, a possibility of getting into a car crash. So therefore, is it unpragmatic to really drive a car? Obviously not. So therefore, we should not be so focused on the consequence, because every decision we make in our daily lives contains negative consequence following it. Moreover, on top of that, pragmatism also requires self-direction. Student-based evaluation is an act of self-direction. So therefore, pragmatism also states that we need to have student-based evaluations. Now, with that being said, let's actually take a look at my opponent's case. Starting off with the first argument. He talked about how student-based are not capable. Subpoint A, maliciousness. Now he gave you the China example. As you can see, part of my definition, you need to read all the requirements of the journal-based evaluation definition of student-based in order to make this point clear. And moreover, on top of that, China, they actually practiced the student-based evaluations in the 1950s, where there are social boundaries and conflicts with the government as well. So therefore, this example is not really a relevant topic that we have to take into consideration when we're talking about student-based evaluations. Subpoint B, bullying. Now there's something funny about this. In general, in this whole contention, we see that there's no concrete evidence of how student-based evaluation will actually is a causation to all of these things that my opponent is talking about. So therefore, what he needs to show is show a clear link or a clear warrant of how student-based evaluation caused all of these problems. He also talked about mid-20s, and he talked about how they're not mature. This is really funny, because that means that we have to extend the vote age restriction to all the way to 25, but that's not the case. We actually restricted to the age of 18, so it does make sense that we have to actually lower it down. With that being said, let's look at subpoint C. He talked about teacher shortage. There's a funny thing about this. According to the New York Times, the reason why there's teacher shortage is not because of student-based evaluations, but it's because that teachers, they knew that they were not actually satisfying the needs of students' education. So therefore, they leave because they were ineffective, not because of student-based evaluations. Now, let's look at this last argument. He talked about how it diminishes education. Subpoint A, subpoint B. He talks about test focus and cheating. Again, like I said, he needs to actually meet all my definition of student-based evaluation in order to make this message clear. But moreover, on top of that, he talked about test focus. There's something you have to understand. Student-based evaluation actually discourages test focus on classrooms according to Ryan Belcher from Vanderbilt University, which is part of my case. Let's not talk about subpoint B, cheating. Now, he listed all these evidence of Houston, Atlantic, and Washington, D.C. It's very funny that actually they did not practice student-based evaluations in these states. So therefore, implementing student-based evaluations will fix this problem. Now, let's actually take a look at my case. There's several things that he needs to actually address. First, we have to understand that he didn't attack my contention 1, subpoint B. He didn't attack my contention 2, subpoint A. He didn't even attack any of my contentions of contention 3 of subpoint A, subpoint B, or subpoint C. Now with that, let's actually take things that several responses that he made. With the first contention of subpoint A, he talked about how it's ineffective. Look how he doesn't have a warrant. So therefore, he needs to show a warrant about this. Moreover, on top of that, I already gave an alternative evidence showing that New York Times states that teacher quality conducted by principal and teacher actually doesn't work. So even though he does say something, it's actually not going to take into consideration. Now, let's look at the second argument. His response to my subpoint B, he talked about Texas A&M, and the 80% comes from family backgrounds. There's a problem there, because actually I'm not here to actually talk about family backgrounds and because this resolution focuses on student-based evaluations and public schools and teacher quality assessments. So this family background is not actually valid in this debate. So therefore, you should vote for pro. Thank you.
You'll use what? All three? Okay.
I'm going to briefly ask the extemporaneous speakers in the audience to meet me outside at this moment right now. Extemporaneous speakers, high school, meet me outside.
First of all, I'd like to defend, rebut, and then tell you my criteria for part 3. First of all, in their first rebuttal, they stated that the value of Madison does not make sense and actually promotes student-based evaluations. However, since I have defined my definition of Madison looks at the consequences, and student-based evaluations does have adverse consequences to it, I believe that their attack on our value does not work, so therefore our value of Madison outweighs our value of education. Now I'll go on to my contentions. First of all, they attacked my contentions one by one by saying that the evidence for students are malicious is actually ineffective, because I used the example of China, which incorporated student-based evaluations, student-based feedback in their methods of getting rid of teachers. And they said this isn't relevant for the same reason. However, I'd like to say that in their definition of student-based evaluations, they incorporated the standards of test scores, feedback, and everything else. So if every single part of those do not work, then it should also mean that the integrated one does not work as well. So, for example, China actually shows that student-based evaluations has failed in that aspect of history. Also, they said that bullying isn't an actual link or warrant to the actual state of student-based evaluations, since I have no evidence that saying that student-based evaluations actually cause more bullying against teachers. However, I'd like to say that this is just an example that students are indeed malicious and can have adverse side effects against teachers as well in a way that they do to each other. In addition, they said since students are not able to determine since their brain is not developed until the age of mid-20s, we should also have voting until the mid-20s. And since this is not the case, our argument that students are not mature enough is false. However, I'd like to say that this is a different matter. So first of all, student-based evaluations, according to their definition, incorporated all the facts of student feedback, again, on teachers, test scores. However, voting is a different thing. Voting does not promote any of these, but it is a decision of whether who will be the better leader for a society. So the argument against that does not work also. And for the attack against my subpoint C, for contention 2, they stated that, contention 1, they stated that there was a teacher shortage, as I've mentioned. However, I have not mentioned anything about that. I just stated that students have too much power in the classroom, therefore if we increase that to a more extent, then it will be even more. It will even deteriorate the system. So it's teacher shortage, since it's already an evident problem, we should not deteriorate it. Also, they stated that student-based evaluations does discourage test focus by citing some evidence. However, I have clearly shown evidence in national data on fair and open testing that student test scores, focusing on student test scores is a bad policy, and student-based evaluations actually do encourage that. Now I would like to move on to the rebuttals against the affirmative case. First of all, in their value, they stated that the value of the high school of education is what should be mattered. However, they have failed to provide any relation to the contentions by stating that student-based evaluations actually lead to the high school of education, so the value is outweighed by our value for Madison. Also, in their first contention, they stated that student evaluations are necessary by saying 6.8, status quo does not work. But as I've stated earlier in my first speech, TNTP studies only had principals evaluate the teachers twice in a year, and so the numerical value of this evaluation is definitely going to be low, so it is unreliable, and their evidence for that is unreliable for that too. So their subpoint A for contention 1 does not make sense. Also, contention 1, subpoint B, they used the example of Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and also stated that poor students and minorities can actually show the same results as wealthy students. However, since Bill and Melinda Gates use information disregarding them, their evidence for that does not work as well, so the contention 1 should be struck. Also, in contention 2, they stated that student-based evaluations actually do lead to the high school of education by improving teacher accountability, and it provides self-motivation. However, since in the first contention subpoint A, they stated that student-based evaluations have a correlated effect on teachers. Since correlation is not a causation, their argument for that is unreliable. Also, in subpoint B, they said that self-motivation is actually encouraged through student-based evaluations, but I have evidence from Texas stating that 80% to 90% of all motivation is actually through family backgrounds. So their argument saying that student-based evaluations is a sole factor for self-motivation is incorrect. So therefore, the contention 2 should also be shown. And in contention 3, they stated that the current bureaucracy protects bad teachers, and through teacher tenure, bad teachers cannot be fired. However, they also admitted to the fact that good teachers are protected under this law. And since I have proven that students are malicious and can evaluate teachers in a horrible manner, student-based evaluations will actually encourage that and actually fire good teachers, as the affirmative has opposed in their third contention. And last but not least, they have failed to respond to any of our burden of proofs. First of all, they have failed to prove that this is actually effective to solve the current status quo problem. Also, they have failed to show the significance of student-based evaluations and how they actually have an effect on students' development and teachers. Also, they have failed to discredit any of our evidence saying that there are adverse side effects. Therefore, please vote for the committee. Thank you.
Can you cut that? All right.
It's true.
Wrap it up. Go ahead.
Now, at first, I'd like to respond to all the burden of proof that the negative team has given. Now, the first one, he talked about how it's going to be effective against status quo. During cross-examination, I already gave you an School of Boston Public Schools, which did adopt his student-based evaluation definition that I told you, and showed how it actually does lead to an increase of high school graduation by 4.6% at the end. So therefore, that does answer his first and second burden of proof, which is about being effective and significant. I already stated that during the cross-examination, so I thought there was no need to repeat it. Now, moving on to his third burden of proof. He said no side effects. Now, there's a problem there, because I told you that student-based evaluation, he needs to meet all my definition of student-based evaluation as a whole in order to show first and then show diverse side effects. But he failed to do that, and that is why we're going to disregard his third burden of proof. Now, since that's the case, I did indirectly already did answer all of his burden of proof. Now, there's something that he actually failed to respond. With looking at the value of pragmatism, I told you that student-based evaluation is an act of challenge, self-interest, and self-direction. He didn't provide any countering to that argument, so therefore he does concede to the fact that student-based evaluation does lead to the value of pragmatism. Also, I talked about how there's always negative consequences in our simple daily lives. He didn't respond to that, so therefore, since that's the case, everything we're doing is going to be unpragmatic, which is really not something we should be talking about in this debate. Now, there's also something that he failed to respond to. When we look at his second contention, sub-point B, I talked about how Houston, Atlantic, and Washington, D.C. does not actually suit my definition of student-based evaluations. He didn't respond to that, so therefore he does concede to the fact that student-based evaluation is really not a causation to all of these problems that he's actually talking about. With that being said, let's actually take a look at several responses that he made during my contention. He talked about how there's no connection between all my contentions to the value of education, but I clearly stated every last argument of mine, the last paragraph, I explained to you how it does lead to my value of education. I already doing that in my first speech, so there's no need for me to redo that. Also, he talked about my evidence. As told you during cross-examination, I already gave you an alternative evidence of the New York Times, how it does show that still Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is still reliable. And I also talked about it from the New York Times that it shows that student-based evaluation does fix the status quo and that principal and teacher peer evaluations does not work. I also asked in his first contention, when we look at his first contention, I asked him to actually show how student-based evaluation is a causation to all of these problems. He didn't respond to that, so therefore he does show, we have to understand that student-based evaluation is not responsible for all of these negative impacts that he's trying to tell you. Also, last but not least, I talked about how student-based evaluation is not my burden of proof. My burden of proof is student-based evaluation will work effectively against, in terms of check and balance the system. He didn't respond to that argument, so therefore it shows that student-based evaluation is going to work at the end. Thank you.
Okay, you guys are all done. Very good.
The debate.
Yes, shake hands.
Let's do another round of applause for our great debaters. We are running a little bit early on time, but let's give our judges a couple moments to finish up their ballots. We're going to take a quick 15-minute break. It's going to be a little bit odd timing, but if everybody could be back in their seats by minute 55, at 2:55, that would be great. Thank you all. Extemporaneous speakers, let's meet in the back room.